Welcome to our latest EdSource Roundtable. My name is Ann Vasquez, the Executive Director of EdSource. We plan to pack a lot of discussion touching on many topics today in the next hour. It's a subject that has always been a hot topic and even more so amid the pandemic and after a number of sweeping changes in the last year, California's college admissions. The landscape for college admissions is changing fast. More students than ever are applying to college and some to the most competitive campuses. With the SAT and ACT no longer required, how are admissions decisions being made? And how are grades earned during the online courses of the past year impacting the process? And lastly, EdSource would not be able to bring us all together for this conversation today were it not for the support of our funders. Thank you to the Stupski Foundation for making today's roundtable possible. And now for our introductions. Please welcome Emily Engelschall, Interim Associate Vice Chancellor of Enrollment Services at UC Riverside. Today at our roundtable, we also have Josh Godinez, a counselor at Centennial High School in Corona, and the president of the California Association of School Counselors. Next, I'm happy to introduce Jessica Ramos, a first-generation college freshman at UC Berkeley, who will share some of her insights after going through the college admissions process last year during the height of the pandemic. Also with us today is Jeff Salingo, the former editor of the Chronicle of Higher Education and a New York Times bestselling author about college admissions. Check out his latest book, Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions. Also joining our discussion today is Brandon Tuck, Director of the Office of Admissions at Cal Poly Pomona. He also has experience at both private and state university systems. And last but not least, our moderator today is EdSource's higher education reporter, Larry Gordon. Welcome, everyone. And Larry, please take it away.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for having us. And we're so happy to have such a great panel of experts with us. So let's dig in right away since we have a lot to cover. So I just wanted to start right away with the issue of standardized testing. Both the University of California and the California State University system have dropped standardized testing, the SAT and the ACT, at least for a few years as a requirement for applicants. And the idea partly was to make it easier for some students to get in, but I think it's probably backfired in ways. It's actually encouraged many more students to try their luck at competitive colleges across California and has reduced some of their chances to get in. UCLA, for example, has seen a 28% increase in the number of applicants, and its acceptance rate actually dropped from already a pretty tough 14% to 11%. And among our experts tonight, at UC Riverside, the number of applications jumped about 8%, and at Cal Poly Pomona, 7%. So, the application pool is actually getting bigger. Meanwhile, many families are wondering about what should they do about the online classes their students have taken, their children have taken, particularly ones that become pass-fail on their records. So jumping in, let's start with Emily and Brandon. I just wanted to ask you, given all of that, how are you making these decisions without things from the past like SAT and full panoply of grades? Emily, can you start?
Speaking for the University of California, I want to just remind everybody that when we review applications on all of our campuses, there are what used to be a total of 14 faculty approved elements of comprehensive review that we used in our decision-making process as we are evaluating applications, and standardized tests were one of those 14 criteria that we used. And now with the elimination of test scores, standardized tests, there still are 13 pieces of information that we are able to use to help inform a decision on admission for the students who are applying to our campuses. The full range of information that's collected on the application is used: grades, the curriculum, the activities. As students are answering the personal insight questions, those obviously create a space for students to really talk about their experiences. And since we don't conduct interviews, that is a space where students can really kind of give us the context behind what their experience looks like. So without test scores, yeah, test scores were one data point that has been removed from our review process, but there still are so many different factors that we use at the University of California to help inform our decisions.
Our process is a little bit different from the UC system. Each CSU campus has their own admission model without the SAT. And that at Cal Poly Pomona, our model is very unique compared to the other CSUs. And so to understand how we got to where we are today, you have to consider where we were before. We used only GPA and SAT or ACT to calculate what we call the eligibility index. And so to determine whether or not a student was admissible to the CSU, and then whether or not they were admissible to a particular major at a campus. And so for Cal Poly Pomona, when the SAT went away, we've included still the GPA is a big part of our model, but now we're looking at other indicators similar to the UC system, not quite 13 different indicators, but we are looking at things like if the student is a local student, veteran status, first gen, extracurricular work experience. So things like that are all incorporated within our model. So it's GPA and plus these additional factors that help us determine admission.
Do you have any sense what has become more important? I mean, have the essays or have the extracurriculars become more important?
From my perspective, I guess what I would say is it's not about what's more important. It's really about what the student is telling us in the context of their individual circumstances that they share with us. So, you know, lots of times we get the question, so grades must be valued much more heavily now that you've eliminated standard test scores, standardized testing from your admissions process. And I would say that that's maybe a fair statement to say that grades are looked at a little bit more closely than now that we don't have this other data point. But what students share with us just overall about the context of their educational environment, the courses that they've had access to or maybe not had access to, and how they've taken advantage of what is available to them, or if courses aren't available to them, what they've done, you know, in terms of taking courses at the community colleges to kind of supplement their learning experience. So for us at the University of California, it's really about looking at the full student and about the context of what the student is bringing and describing to us on their application.
It really is about looking at the full student. I do think GPA is one of the most important factors and makes up a great percentage of our model, admission model. And we have a lot of history on the student and how they progress academically through their high school career. But we also collect a lot of information on the application that we weren't using in the past. So I think this is an opportunity with the pandemic. It created an opportunity for us to now incorporate other things that were on the application and give those things weight that weren't necessarily given weight before. And so that's, you know, unique to the CSU, but I think this is an exciting opportunity for students to have certain things and their experiences recognized that weren't recognized before.
I'm going to turn to Josh and Jeff and ask them to weigh in on this question. Do you feel that there is more pressure now for grade inflation as a result of this? I mean, do your students and more importantly, the faculty feel that they are very reluctant to give bad grades because they're counting more? And do you think that's, you know, possibly could wind up advantaging more affluent students who can get help on issues of essay writing and even helping to pump up their extracurriculars?
It's a great question, Larry, and thank you for having me here today. And I want to echo a little bit with what Emily and Brandon said with the standardized testing piece first and foremost. It was a celebration as I talked to counselors across the state that got pulled for exactly the reasons that you're talking about. The equity in access to programs that might have included additional tutoring for more affluent families. It really was a game that some students that were socioeconomically disadvantaged didn't feel they had equal access in playing all of these years. And I think that truly added to the surge in applications. I'm not seeing that students are they understand that there is more value in their grades, but I'm not seeing teachers feel the pressure to give better grades. What I'm seeing right now with AB 104 in California is students figuring out how best to play the game. I've seen students that might be your more advanced student in AP and IB programs looking at those 4.0 weighted grades, even if it was in a visual arts class or another class that might be a 4.0, and they may have gotten an A in it, but you see them applying to turn that into a pass because the rest of their schedule is full of AP courses. And so if we're talking grade inflation, we do see some of the kids playing the game that way, thinking that the closer I can get to that 5.0, the better my opportunity is to get into the university systems.
What about you, Jeff? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, Larry, I think that the even before COVID, the application, and I remember when I was inside the process at Emory University in Atlanta, John Ladding, who's the dean of admissions there, talked about kind of these curated applications that come, and you really don't know how real anything is, right? You have grades that were always inflated from some schools. You have SAT scores that are coached, multiple tries at the SAT. You have recommendations where nobody will say anything negative about anybody. You have essays that were coached, right? You had extracurricular activities where, again, so it was always like he felt that there was nothing, he was always trying to figure out, like, where is the authentic student in some of these, especially students who had, really good counseling or hired private counselors in many cases to really bring that curation in. And, at these very selective schools, where they're getting inundated with applications, again, there is no app. We tend to talk about admissions as a process. There really isn't a single process, right? There are thousands of schools out there. They all follow something slightly different. So it's really hard for, I think, any of us to talk about this is how it's done. I was only inside the process at 3 schools, a big public, a small liberal arts college, a big private, and all 3 of them did something very different in terms of how they reviewed applications. But in all cases, the grades and high school courses, even before COVID, really counted a lot more at those places than almost everything else, right? Because most institutions want to know, is the student going to also be able to do the work once they're here? And the data shows that course selection and grades in high school really equal student success once they're at college at many of these institutions. And so that's why they would lean into those more than, a score on a 3 or 4 hour standardized test. I think what's really important going forward, and I'm actually working on a piece about this now, is what does the application really tell us? And do we need to have all that information? So the Common App, for example, this year conducted an experiment with direct admissions, where they basically said to a group of students who had started a Common App application but hadn't submitted it, because you have these grades, you're automatically admitted to these schools in these 3 states. And I think that there's a lot of schools out there that claim to have holistic admissions, claim to be somewhat selective when they're really not. And I think that there's no reason from an access standpoint that I think that we need to be asking students to jump through all these hoops on a college application. Because in many cases, I think we're asking students for way too much information, at least in the initial application. And perhaps we could ask them for less in the beginning, kind of see if they're in the realm of possibility for our institution, see if it's a good match, and then ask them for more. But this idea that we have to ask all these questions up front, I think the application in many cases, particularly for first generation students and low income students, is a real barrier.
Thank you, Jeff. I did want to follow up on something that Josh mentioned, which was AB 104, which is that it allows the pass-fail option or the pass option for students during the pandemic year. For all of you, do students have the advantage of using that? Should they be using it? Should they not? Is it going to look good or bad if there are a lot of passes rather than grades? Or is it because it's allowed and it's been accepted, we know, going forward for that year? Should they do it?
So that's the $1 million question, right? And it's not easy to navigate that. And honestly, based on the students' individual circumstances, I think they need to have real conversations with their counselors and about what is the best move for them given their individual academic circumstances. I think when it comes to the admissions side of things, when we're looking at what a student is presented on the application, there is large concern about the number of pass, no pass grades that are showing on a application, just from the pure sense of that's another data point that we're not seeing on a student. So how we are looking at the application in circumstances like that, we're taking those grades at face value, of course, and doing what we can to evaluate the application given the full context of what the student is showing us and telling us, and really then just that what we've got to help inform an admissions decision on an academic side of things is really looking at the curriculum that the student has taken. If they've been taking a progressively challenging curriculum, regardless of the pass, no pass component that's there, what are some of the maybe extracurricular activities that they've participated in that are academically focused to add to the story about whether or not the student will have an opportunity to be successful at one of our campuses. So it does make the admissions process much more challenging. And when you think about what the admissions professionals experienced this past year with the pass, no pass, with COVID, and with the removal of standardized tests, it's really hard to kind of pinpoint any sort of kind of trends or trajectory, because so much happened and came together all at once that really did change the landscape of how we're looking at applications.
I think when, to that question, we have to ask, why did we allow pass or credit? And the reason is COVID. And we have to have sympathy for these students and their experiences. I have 3 little ones, and I was trying to teach them basic math during COVID, and that was a struggle. I barely survived myself. So I can only imagine what these students are going through. And so pass and credit was created for that reason, to help these students that are going through difficult situations. So unfortunately, I think with that, there is a strategy to pass and credit, using that, when to use it, when not to use it. Obviously, if it's going to help your GPA, you want to have the grade. And so we've created this. We don't look at it any different. We don't treat these students any different. And we just want to help them the best that we can. This is an unusual time. And so really, there's just the strategy of how you can use the pass credit. That's why they have people like Josh to help get them through there. And we have admission counselors as well to help guide students on what's best.
Well, and with that said, I would say too, the one thing that we have to keep in mind that panelists that we don't have on the call right now is the private school representative. And in talking to a lot of private school admissions officers, one thing that we're finding is there's a lot of merit-based scholarship money out there. And so as kids are exploring that with the private schools, getting that GPA over a particular mark might mean more money for them. And so as Brandon and Emily were talking about, it really, at the end of the day, is all about access and all about giving kids an opportunity to get as much financial support as possible so that they're successful with the next chapter in their life.
And I would just add too, I think on the 4-year side of things, we have an obligation to ensure that these students are successful coming in, and to acknowledge kind of that learning loss that students have experienced. That will be happening. To what Brandon said, he's got little ones, that will impact students who are currently in elementary school in terms of the learning loss they experienced and what that means, 5, 6, 7 years when they're applying. And so on our campus, as well as my sister campuses, that is a topic to ensure that once students make the decision to come to our campuses, we are aware of the learning loss that our students have experienced, and ensure that there's the right kind of resources in place to move these students through and to fill in those gaps.
You know, right now we are 2 days and a month away from the deadline for UC and CSU applications, at least. Privates go a little longer. So I wanted to turn to both Jessica and to Josh for a minute and ask them, hypothetically, if you have a friend or a cousin who right now is facing this deadline and they're kind of stressed out, not knowing what to do, you know, their parents may be hovering and yelling at them. Not that I have any experience doing that with my own daughter, but you know, what would you tell people? You know, they have a month and 2 days to get it together. And you know, what would you tell them to do? How would you prioritize it? Jessica, you just went through this a year ago. So do you have any thoughts? What you would tell somebody?
Absolutely. I am a first generation student and I went through the struggle. I actually did my applications the night of and completed all of them and did everything on the night of. So definitely I know how it feels when you're like on the timeline and don't know what to do and don't know who to go to, because during COVID you had nobody to go to. Most college advisors were busy and were booked. And my cousins and all of them have never gone to college, so it was just mostly on me. So I'm currently taking, I took 10 students from my own high school and my own town, and currently am advising them and also helping them with their essays. And pretty much what I would say is just kind of keep it true to yourself, share what you want to share, because not your story is not the same as thousands of students who are applying as well. Yes, you could use a pandemic story, but at the end of the day, you have so much stories out there that, you know, this is for your personal statements, that you have so much stories out there from since you were a kid to the people that you have involved and got impacted by. Definitely don't share that, because I know I've heard a lot of admissions being like, you know, I've heard the pandemic story, I've heard that 300 times, 200 times, I want to hear something more about you. So definitely like dig deep. You have a month, go ahead, explore yourself, explore things that you have not wanted to talk about. Maybe those things might be the spark to your story.
Great for you for giving back, Jessica. Great that you're doing that.
Josh, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, what I would say is, as we've been going through this, we've gone from 0 to 100 academically. And so our students are trying to navigate their new normal. And so one thing that I am doing with students is we are taking it piece by piece. We're laying out dates so that we are chunking applications, we're chunking personal statements, we're chunking FAFSA, so that it seems more manageable and it seems a little bit slower. Because one thing that we know over the last year and a half is that we were doing what we needed to do to get by. Well, that's not the case anymore. Now that we're back to school and we're going full steam ahead, it's a lot of understanding how to get through the day at the speed that once existed for a lot of these students. So just taking it and chunking it up makes all the difference and makes it seem manageable for them.
Anybody else have any last minute advice for?
I would say what was shared by Jessica and Josh is spot on. I would also encourage students to really kind of take a look at all of the university options out there. I think students and parents mainly, I'm one myself, have a tendency to you know, have the brand names in your head and are thinking about that those are the end all and be all, and really kind of explore all the different opportunities that are out there, because it's really about fit and about how you as an individual are going to blossom at a particular campus, and what's right for you may not be right for someone else. And also really research the majors. I know a lot of times students don't have a sense of what they want to do, so they'll put down biology or psychology. Students who apply to UCR, about 60% of our applicants apply to 10 of our 100 majors. We have so many majors to offer that can take you down a similar path as biology, if you want to go to med school, for example. So I would say really explore the majors and think creatively and differently.
I guess, Larry, the one piece of advice I would give, and when following students a couple of years ago through the process, and followed a couple of dozen through the process for the book. One of the things that I saw that they do, because they're applying to multiple schools sometimes, with multiple different applications, multiple deadlines, is they tend to think of them as one big group. And each institution is very different in what they need. Their applications are sometimes different in terms of the supplemental questions that they want. And really what you're trying to do as a student is make the best case you can for that, why that institution should accept you. And so I really, my advice is to think of these applications as individual institutions and individual applications, rather than, it's fine, they would have these big Google sheets and they would be pulling statements from each one and thinking of these institutions as a whole rather than individually. So think consecutively rather than concurrently when you're filling out the application.
Thank you very much. Those are great answers. Let's take a bit of a detour here into another topic. And this has been huge news story for the past year and a half. And this is about the varsity blues scandal in admissions and briberies to get people into some top-notch schools. California's been at the center of that. USC, Stanford, UCLA, there have been campuses all across the state that have been tainted by this. And one of the super interesting in Jeff's book, and I'll plug it here with the cover, he writes about a really interesting trend that, you would think maybe that families and students would run in disgust and horror away from some of the schools that have been tainted with these scandals. But in fact, the reverse seems to be happening. Parents and students seem to be thinking, okay, well, if this millionaire is willing to risk, $1 million bribe and risk going to college, then maybe this is good enough for my kid. I should pursue whatever I have. So, I have a question. Let's just start with Jeff in this, but I'd love to hear from everybody, and Jessica too, from the point of young people. I mean, do you have a sense that trust in the admissions system and its fairness and its equity has really collapsed? Or do you think that people still think that the average person can get a fair shake?
Oh, I'm not quite sure there was even trust in the admission system before. And not necessarily trust, but this ability of no visibility into it, right? That it is not a transparent system. And it's interesting, Larry, a couple of weeks ago, I brought together characters from the book at the NACAC conference, which is the big gathering, the National Association of College Admissions Counselors. And so it brings together high school counselors as well as college admissions counselors. And this was really the idea behind this panel is, how can we make admissions more transparent, or should we? And really the consensus among that group was that the more we talk about what happens on the other side of the desk, meaning inside the admissions offices, the more we talk about it, the more that people want to know, but what about this, or what about that student, right? So the more that you talk about what's happening in those rooms, and people take that as gospel, essentially, then they'll always say, but I know this student who wasn't accepted for that reason. You just said students are accepted for this reason, or this is why we denied these students, right? So in some ways, these admissions officers were arguing for less transparency, because the more transparent you are, the more questions it raises around admissions. So I don't think it's necessarily a trust issue, but admissions is really a black box that most students and families never see inside of. I was very lucky to do it with 3 schools, but one of the things I always tell people is 21 schools, because I approached 24 in total. 21 schools said no to me when I first approached them about doing this book, because they didn't want their admission system, including some publics in California. They didn't want their admission system put out there for everybody to see.
Jessica, do you have any thoughts about that issue of fairness?
Absolutely. I think it's always been this thing about that it's kind of like luck, and we've seen it as students as luck. If you're many low-income students say, if you're not from a family that doesn't make more than 100,000 a year, then you won't know what even college is, to the point. Because admissions has always been there for, admissions is just like this secret of, kind of want to say it like, what's the new show that came out, Squid Games. I don't know if you guys have watched it. It's kind of like that, we kind of get put into this system of whoever gets chosen, and we don't really know anything behind what's behind the scenes. So never has been trust, I would say, with admissions, and it's just this type of luck game.
Brandon, what do you say about it?
I enjoyed Squid Game, and I actually selective some of the selective private schools do put students through a squid game to get admitted. And I think there's been a lot of weight put onto a person's intellect on, okay, I got into a school that selects, less than 10% of the people get in. And then people associate, oh, you must be smart. You got into this school. And that's an unfortunate thing. And the SAT has also became that. You scored this on the SAT, you must be smart. And so for me, I think maybe I'm an oddball admission director, but I believe in transparency. A lot to what Jeff said. It doesn't need to be a black box. I've operated in a black box admission office in the past. And so you can go to the Cal Poly Pomona admission website and we share our student profiles. And so students, I don't necessarily tell you, the exact weights and percentages that you need to score in each area, but you can see if you're in the ballpark. And so I think that helps students. It provides them some guidance as they're applying. And so kind of connected to the earlier question is, what do you value? What are you, and what is the school value? What are they looking for? And is there a connection there? And sometimes it's down to maybe not scores, but do you want to be in a city or the suburbs? What are some of the career opportunities? And so I know we don't do a good enough job of that now in the college arena, but we're working on it, is showing career outcomes. And so what are the career outcomes based on these majors? And so a lot of it, I think, is we're starting to peel it back. And unfortunately, these things have to happen, like Varsity Blues and COVID, for us to act, but we are making, at least I know I'm making steps to be more visible and transparent in what we do.
Larry, can we just rewind for 1 second? Because I think the context that's important here is, there are thousands of colleges and universities in the US. It's a huge sector, 1,400 plus colleges or four-year colleges alone. The average acceptance rate is 65% of American colleges and universities. So most colleges accept most students. What we're really talking about when we talk about admissions, I think, in the culture of Hollywood, in the culture of, to be honest with you, the national press, and I think we take a little blame for this sometimes, is that we're talking about these selective schools, of which there are only about 200. Even among those, you have some that are like the University of Washington that accept 45%, and then these ultra selectives that are, or some will call them ultra rejectives, that will accept fewer than 10%, right? But it's a tiny, tiny piece of the entire higher education pie. And one thing that I wish we would do more of, and again, I'll even take a little bit of the blame in this in the media, is that we need to really extend the lens or widen the lens for students and families to see that there's so many options out there that are, quote unquote, not hard to get into, that provide access and aid. And by the way, you get a really good education at these places. In fact, I might argue you get possibly a better education than some of these other places that we tend to talk about all the time, because there are faculty and other advisors and mentors that actually care about their undergraduates at these places.
And I would echo that, if I can, Larry, real quick, that is one part of the conversation that we can't forget, is how many colleges and universities are out there, just like Jeff said, that don't have necessarily the money or the prestige for the students. And oftentimes I feel like I'm doing the upsell with students, and I know a lot of counselors are, and that's been a giant push for us across the state, is making sure that there are counselors in schools. And we've seen an uptick in the number of counselors, because when students have access to school counselors, we can have those conversations that, hey, there are some fantastic universities that might not be on your radar, but would be an absolute perfect fit for you.
Josh, along that line, while we're on this topic, what about telling your students, let's go to community college, and transfer later on? Let's avoid, this process right now. And do you actively tell some students, go to this route? Do you feel like, that you are having your arm bent not to say that?
Great question. No, for us as counselors, we are not in the business of telling students what to do with the future. For us, we figure out with them what their goals and aspirations are, and we show them the many routes there are to getting there. Sometimes it's going straight to the 4-year, sometimes it's going 2-year, then 4-year, sometimes it's going to the 2-year, because part of the education that we have to do is sharing with the student the best route for them. Like, if you're going to be a cosmetologist, you're not going to go to UCR to be a cosmetologist, but sometimes they don't understand that. And so doing the education around that is the school's counselor's job. And so my job is to help them find the many routes to being a cosmetologist, where if you want to go be a lawyer, as Emily was saying and brilliantly stated earlier, they automatically think, I'm going to be a lawyer, I need to get poli-sci or I need to get criminal justice. When in fact, there are so many majors that students can go after that lead them down that route, like English. You know, to learn how to write is important if you're going to get a law degree. So it's our job to help them understand the many routes that might not be as impacted for students in order to start their post-secondary careers.
I would
Emily,
say
can you talk about that a little bit, about not only about what he was saying about the different majors, but also, can you compare the difficulty of coming in application-wise as a freshman to coming in as a transfer student, to let some people know that, you know, there is this opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk about transfer. Transfer is an excellent pathway for students, with some caveats. But let me say this, that when you think about transferring to the University of California, it can be a very much straightforward, clear pathway, especially since 6 of the 9 undergraduate campuses have a transfer admissions guarantee program that's really, and it's a guarantee to the campus and it's a guarantee to the particular major. And if students complete the defined courses that are outlined within the guarantee. So it's a really great option for students. We have counselors in our spaces that are out at the community colleges on a regular basis working with students. So I'd say it's a wonderful pathway. The caveat that I would give is that students have to be super focused when they come to community college if they want to get out in 2 years and transfer to the UC in that 2-year time frame. If students are willing to take a little bit longer, like 3 years at the community college to explore, because that's another reason to go to the community college when you're not really sure kind of what your direction is, that's fine too. But if you are a student that wants to be in and out in 2 years at a community college, you need to make sure that you're connecting with a counselor to create an educational plan that gets you on track to be taking the right courses you need at the lower division level to prepare you adequately for transfer into the UC, into that particular major. But a wonderful pathway for students.
And can you give us some percentages? What percentages of your transfer applicants get accepted?
So overall, our admit rate for transfer students is roughly around 65%. When you look at it by major though, or by program, that's going to differ pretty dramatically. In terms of our engineering programs, a little bit more selective. If you're in the social sciences and humanities, admit rates are higher than 65%. So it's an excellent pathway.
And Brandon, can you weigh in on that too, about your thoughts about the desirability of coming in as a transfer student?
Yeah, ours is around 60% as well for transfers that are being admitted. It's a great opportunity. We have our associate, I agree with everything Emily said. You have to be focused, stay connected with your advisor or counselor, but we have an associate degree for transfer, gives you an opportunity to come in and finish in 2 years at the CSU. We also have an opportunity for our local colleges, community colleges, to come in, and we have a local advantage for those students and a local guarantee for non-impacted majors. So there's a lot of opportunities for those students. We also recently have a Cal Pi Pomona staff member and advisor who is on one of our local community college campuses to help guide students So we're really about helping these students through to the CSU and creating a pathway for them. Another thing that we're looking at doing, because currently we look at only their GPA, a transfer student's GPA, and determining admission to the CSU and Cal Poly Pomona specifically. And so what we're looking to do on our campus is create a model that will look at the whole student, much like we do for the freshman population. So we'll be using other indicators beyond GPA to start making our transfer admission decisions.
Right, thank you.
I did want to jump in from the audience, Larry. We're getting lots of questions. I appreciate all the questions coming in. And for those of you who are answering in the chat, a question came in about, and this is more pre-pandemic, but still probably an issue. Their child's school has, many students with high GPAs. It's a high achieving school. The question is, in terms of getting accepted into CSUs or UCs, has heard many of those students even having a hard time. So does coming from a high achieving school put some students at a disadvantage because they're being judged against that pool?
So I'll say what I've said earlier when it comes to this. I would say no, they're not going to be disadvantaged because they're coming from a high achieving pool. But we are looking at the individual student that's applying from that school within the context of the opportunities available to them. So if it's a school that is very resourced and has a lot of different opportunities and that a student hasn't necessarily taken advantage of, that will be part of the application decision process. But if the students have taken advantage of it and have more than that, have really done a thoughtful job of articulating that on their application, or why they haven't taken advantage of that. So on the reverse, and articulated that through their application and the materials that they're presenting, it's all that's all part of the decision-making process. Just looking at the student in the context of what's available to them.
And I'll answer that outside of the UC and CSU context. This past year in particular, places like the University of Washington, Georgia Tech, for example, really leaned into actually their history with high schools. And this happens on the private level at private institutions all the time. In other words, busy high schools that send a lot of applications to certain schools actually end up doing better in the process over time, because at the private schools, for example, those admissions offices know those students can perform at that school. They also know they're going to yield when they get accepted. And at places like the University of Washington and Georgia Tech, this year, they without SAT scores and ACT scores, they leaned into the data they had on students from those high schools. So again, they were more willing to accept those students because they had the assurances in some ways that they could do the work. So again, outside of the CSU context, but in those cases, it actually was more helpful to be from those competitive high schools, particularly in this most recent cycle.
Right. I want to put Jessica on the spot for a second. Jessica, can you tell us, I know the answer, but tell us, how many campuses did you apply to? And if you regret that number, and what will you tell people about that?
Yes, I was never directed or was never told how many campuses I should apply to. So I applied to 30, which is a lot for a lot of students, and I did not think about it. I did go for the brand name, so definitely did expect to get into some. So I applied to 30. I got into 22 of them. I went back to my list and got into NYU, UCLA, big names, and definitely didn't know which schools, how did the financial aid work, didn't know anything. And most of all, I was like, where do I go from this? And I kind of went with the school that gave more financial aid and also had the resources for my major. That's one thing that's are not talked about, is about how can students research and be able to know how to get their majors, what am I interested in, does the school offer it? And definitely just go on the website, be able to look for, do a little research, look at, sociology, psychology, computer science, look at those different things. There's a lot much more. I know UC Riverside has so many good ones that, a lot of people don't tend to look at. And yeah, that's how I kind of chose my school. I chose UC Berkeley just because of financial aid. I did get a full ride because they have a lot of scholarships again. And I did also choose because of the major. I'm also doing social welfare with a minor in public health. Well, and I'll probably be going into the pre-law as well.
So Josh and other people feel free to chime in. What number of campuses or applications do you think is a good number? I know there's no fixed, but do you tell your students don't go over 10?
Yeah, I usually tell them stay between about 8 and 12 and then vary the basket. Make sure to have some Cal State, some UCs and some privates in there so that we just see what happens. It's always a roll of the dice, right? So we don't want to dedicate ourselves just to one institution.
Anybody else have thoughts on that?
One thing, Larry, that I found in my reporting is that 9, 10, perhaps probably at the max, but in terms of thinking about a balanced list, right? That you don't have that you have schools that you're maybe stretching for a little bit academically, schools that are solidly in the middle, schools that are foundational schools that you think you might have a pretty good shot at. Nothing's guaranteed, of course, but also a balanced list in terms of social fit and financial fit. I saw so often in my reporting students and families who kind of put all their eggs in a couple of baskets in that list, and then they just added a bunch of schools else on the list because they knew they had to, but really didn't think about those schools until it was much later in the process. And those were the schools that were their choices at the end. And so, thinking about this balance list from right in the beginning, having that balance of academics, social, and financial is really important in my mind.
And if I can tag back in real quick, always encourage the students to apply to the local community college too, just because you never know. And having that application in and that in on the FAFSA or the California Dream Act at least gives them plan B to consider.
Right. I want to go back to something that Emily raised before about talking about schools that are highly resourced and judging students within that context. Often that means that if a kid's going to a school that offers 15 AP classes and they only take one of them, that student is going to be looked at a little bit in askance. And then there's also the issue of high schools that offer dual enrollment with community colleges. And one of our audience members had asked, is there any difference for a student, any advantage to taking a dual enrollment class versus taking AP classes, or how those judged differently and weighed differently?
I'm going to go back to my pat answer about the context, right? So no, we don't look at least at the University of California, we don't look at AP or IB or dual enrollment or community college differently. In fact, all of them are, get the extra GPA bump in the GPA calculation. And it's really just a matter of, so there could be a student that is, an example would be a student is attending a high school that's under-resourced, doesn't offer a lot of AP courses, but that student has gone above and beyond and enrolled in a community college and taken some courses there to get a sense of what a college course may look and feel like. That's really kind of an opportunity where a student has taken advantage of resources given their limited circumstances at their high school. So they are all looked at equally by the University of California.
Brandon, you have any thoughts about that?
Ours is similar to Emily with the GPA bump. The one advantage I would say is if you pass the community college course, you do get college credit. And so with the AP test, you have to pass the AP exam. And so there is, something to be said about that. Also, it kind of gets you in that college setting as well. So that helps students kind of get used to, okay, this difference between high school and college. Going back to the earlier question is about, I agree with Jeff on the values of what students, when they're seeking out their college and applying to college. And I would like to flip it and say that colleges need to do the same thing, and that their admission process should reflect what they value. And so sometimes these colleges ask questions, I think just to ask questions or to get in like a competition with one another, like, oh, you're asking this essay question, let me ask this question. And so for us, I know what we do, our questions are all centered around what the CSU believes in terms of access, but then also our polytechnic nature. So what that means is that for our STEM programs that are impacted, we value students that are pushing themselves and taking additional math courses. And then we also look at the particular math GPA for those courses. So it kind of aligns with the rigor of those STEM impacted programs. And then we let students know up front that that's part of the admission process for those majors.
Jessica, I saw you nodding your head earlier when there was the talk about dual enrollment and AP classes. Curious, what was your experience, and did you favor one type of class over another? What was your experience like?
Yes, I was actually going to add on right now, but I did do more dual enrollment classes more than AP classes, just because I also do the prerequisites for my I did for the UCs, so I did it for sociology. I did the English, the math, and definitely recommend the English and math if you're doing dual enrollment, just so you can be able to get that boost to once you transfer over, once you go to your freshman. Basically go to your freshman year, you already have your prerequisites, already have your general ed courses that most UCs already have. And APs, I'm not a big fan of them just because of how the system is with them, but definitely not a lot of schools, like my school did not have a lot of AP classes, so I didn't get to have that many classes taken. And also we were not allowed to take AP classes until our junior and senior year. So we couldn't take more than 2. So there was a whole disadvantage of that. So definitely recommend one of the dual enrollment classes. And I saw the comments about if there's a boost or if there's not a boost. Definitely there is a tiny bit of a boost. I saw it in my GPA. I don't know if all high schools or each district allows it as well.
I wanted to move back into the issue of people all experiencing the COVID and isolation and people writing about that. Several of our audience members have posed questions about during COVID, their student or themselves may have experienced some emotional or mental problems, even, people who really had deep mental struggles and psychological struggles. Should they write about that? And, what people seem to be afraid that the universities might hold that against students in various ways and that it could hurt their application. To Emily and Brandon.
Absolutely. If they're comfortable writing about it, they should write about it. And I think, but more importantly, it's not about writing specifically about the individual struggle. It's about how they responded to that struggle in the moment. So not just sharing with us, and even kind of tying it back to their academic experience, because as we're reading applications and may see some struggles during the pandemic years in their grades. If students address that in their personal insight questions and talk about what they were experiencing, but then to what I was saying earlier, how they specifically went back and addressed that, what they learned from it, how they would apply what they learned at a 4-year with their experience. So that's what we're looking for. Not just the struggles, but what was learned from that experience.
Josh, have you had any students who are writing about that, and are you having to advise them in any way to how to handle a delicate topic?
Yeah, and hearing Emily, I'm glad to hear that, because that's exactly what I've said. It's about the grit and it's about the resilience and the perseverance. One little bird walk I did want to address is that when, and Emily, maybe you can help me with this, when it gets to the section where it asks, is there anything more that we should know? The one thing that I'm advising students is make sure to include any classes that you had planned to take that you weren't able to take because of the pandemic. Many schools and districts across California had to split their staff so that, they might have, had a virtual school and an on-campus school last year, depending on how their community was responding to it. as the year went on. And so some of the AP classes that we might normally have been able to offer across California weren't offered because of a staff issue to navigate the COVID pandemic. So make sure in those systems, if you were or your child was one of those students that had some sort of obstacle to taking something that they would have otherwise taken in a normal year, that is shared as part of that experience.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, Josh. And another piece that can be added to that as well is, you know, a lot of students weren't able to participate in co-curricular activities during the pandemic as well, that they traditionally have had the opportunity to do, or they've been doing long-term, and that was those opportunities were cut off for them during those pandemic semesters. So that would be another place or piece where they could talk about that experience too.
Great. You know, unbelievably, the hour is flying by. So I wanted to go around the room here and ask everybody our final question. You know, if you were the ruler of the admissions world universe and you could change or improve one or two things in the entire process in any direction, from high school, from elementary school to, you know, all the way up to the admissions decision and acceptance, what would you say would be your most important thing to reform or change? Let's start with Jeff.
I would go back to what I was saying earlier about transparency, that I think that colleges ask for too much, as was said earlier about some colleges just are trying to compete with each other on this. So I would have transparency. I like this idea of perhaps coming up with some sort of clearinghouse that students can say what they really want out of college, colleges can say what they really want out of students, and perhaps we could start more matching students so that they don't have to apply to so many schools that they apply to now. So I would kind of blow up the system a little bit as we have it now, because it's a really inefficient system. There were more than 11 million college applications filed last year, and there's still only a couple of million students applying to or graduating from high school every year. So they're just applying to too many places.
Brandon, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I think there's two things. I think there's a large group of students that have stopped out. And so I would make an easier route for returning students to come back to college. There's a large population of people that just never finished their degree. And so I agree with Jeff, we asked too many questions on the application, and so it's intimidating. So a short application for this group of students and anyone and other students in general. And then the other thing, I was talking to my boss, Jessica Wagner, earlier, and we were talking about transcripts. And so an easier way for students to be able to submit their transcripts, but also transcript fees. It can be difficult for a lot of students. And so I feel like there's a way that we can waive some of these costs to students so that they can send their transcripts to universities at the time of application.
Emily, any thoughts?
I'll be quick. I would blow up the college ranking system. I think that is that college rankings, I think, are a lot of what we talked about today is an artifact of that system being in place and just increasing applications to the most selective campuses, just driving applications in a way that is unsustainable. And contributes to the lack of transparency, contributes to a lot of what we have talked about today. So if I had my wish, we would get rid of that.
Josh?
I think for us, showcasing more what happens after you earn that degree, what jobs are the universities seeing their people access, so that we are doing a lot less on the selling end and students can see all of the different degrees they could earn for the exact same job. And
Jessica, you just went through this. So what would you say if you could change everything? You know,
Definitely,
one or two thoughts.
Definitely agreeing. If I wish I was told this question a year ago, because I would have had such more answers, but definitely what Josh was saying, like what different degrees can lead to different pathways and exploring more degrees. And also what Jeff was saying about having a more matching selective college type instead of writing these essays and essays and essays and not getting anything in some way, but definitely having this matching type of seeing that this college is for you and will support you in every way that you want to go.
Well, I just wanted to jump in. We are at the hour. I wanted to thank all of you for a wonderful discussion. Larry, great job moderating. I think we could continue for another hour if we wanted to, and we could probably just delve into one of the many topics we talked about. So more to come. For those of you in the audience, thank you for all of the great questions. We tried to answer as many of them in the chat or live in discussion. We will share our video from today later on this week. And thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.